Welcome to Ethics Today. It's a program dedicated to the art of listening, to taking a step back and listening carefully to people who have important things to say about what's going on in our society today. Today's guest is Keonte Turner, who is a fellow resident of La Crosse. He serves on the La Crosse School Board, is also a member of the Martin Luther King Community Celebration Committee, and I know you're involved in a lot of other groups as well, but thank you so much for joining us and
Thanks for having me.
Talking today. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because we're friends. We've known each other for 5 or 6 years, and we've been playing basketball together, and so we've developed a relationship that is where we have shared interest. So our friendship is not based on our differences, it's based on something we have in common.
Absolutely.
And of course, in that situation, it makes it a lot easier then to have difficult conversations about what our differences are, right?
Absolutely.
So this is a question that has bothered me, and I just see it coming up especially among white people when the topic of race comes up, and that is the discomfort that many of us feel in even talking about race. Partly because we don't want to give offense, partly because we're afraid of being criticized for saying the wrong thing or expressing the wrong tone or using the wrong assumptions. So that's how I wanted to start this conversation. Like, what advice would you give to me for how I even talk about race in this kind of volatile situation we have?
Yeah. So I think it's important for us to understand that this is a white person's problem, right? I really feel that we need to understand and approach it from that standpoint. The Black American or the African did not create the concept of race, right? Race is a social construct that is not biology. There are not any chromosomes or genes that literally differ us by way of race. So I really feel like, although it's a very good question for me, and I have a plethora of ideas, but I think that what we need to do now is we need to let white people first pose the question, right? How do I talk about race? And then to answer it as well. Because for far too long, we have been the mouthpieces for what justice looks like. We have shared these things also, right? How do you talk about race amongst your white comrades or constituents? And it hasn't really gotten us anywhere, to be completely honest. So I really feel like that's a question for white America. How do you try to detach yourselves, right, from, of course, I understand the concept of being vulnerable, saying things wrong, right? Like, we all feel this stuff. But I really think the best way to answer that is to actually just start talking about it. As a 29-year-old who comes from one of the most segregated cities, literally in the country, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, those conversations are not being had, right? And so when I got to La Crosse, it was very, very important for me to be involved in having these conversations or starting these conversations with people that did not look like me. And it was to ruffle feathers. It was to get people to understand that, hey, talking about race is uncomfortable, right? But we need to understand that we mustn't just not talk about it, right? So I think that the logical question to that is just start. You know, try to find a way to find people where, first of all, I think the conversation needs to be held amongst other white people, right? Because if it is uncomfortable to you that you have that conversation in front of me, then you need to find other white people to have that conversation with, because most certainly that is probably where it needs to be, right? There's really nothing that a white person is going to teach me about race, or what injustice looks like, or what justice looks like, rather, right? But you can then go to people and spark that idea in them, you know? So I just believe that to answer that question, you know, the best way I possibly can, without actually giving you the answers to the quiz, right? We don't learn anything if I'm just giving you the answers. I really feel like we need to make sure that we come up with those answers for ourselves. When I say we, I mean white people, white America comes up with those answers by themselves. But just to start the conversation, period. I think we feel like we're too far along right now where, these questions have been posed, or these conversations are being had. And sadly, all around this country, these conversations are not being had. So I think the first approach to it is to have the conversations.
Yeah, and that's, I think, lots of times what happens is people just opt out of the conversation because it is either it's uncomfortable for them, or they don't want to give offense. And
Sure.
And so that's one of the things I appreciate about you, is that it's easy to be really open with you. But you are also in a situation, you come from Milwaukee to La Crosse. We've got a very white city, as you know very well.
Very.
Oftentimes you end up being the only person of color in the room, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So how often are you asked to kind of, where there's an assumption, either explicit or implicit, that you will be kind of a spokesperson for all Black people?
Sure. Quite often, actually. There are only, sadly, there are people on the grounds doing this work, right? There are people that have their boots strapped up. I am one of those people. Shondell Spivey, as you know, is one of those people. And a lot of the times we actually are those photo ops. We are those people to come in and to ask questions via email or phone. I'll give you a really good, so we have a lot of protests going on in the city right now. And there are people asking me and asking other members of Black Leaders Acquiring Collective Knowledge, is it okay if we do this? Is this right? Is this okay that we lie on the ground, right? Or if we say this, can our signs say this? And my response to that is that if you are asking me if you need to do it, then you don't need to do it, right? And so many of the times in these boardrooms, right, I am the token Black face. I live in a predominantly white community. I know this, right? And so it doesn't deter me from actually trying to do better for this community as a whole, or trying to do better for my people in La Crosse, the Black community rather. But it is a little discerning when I get phone calls like, hey, could you come and speak here? And I've actually turned down many interviews. This is the only thing that I'm doing. Just because we have a relationship, I know you for years and years and years. So this was comfortable to me. But I'm just not a fan anymore, because I used to be, of giving white people the answer, right? And so I just really feel like they need to search for it. And it might be a little deeper into them, right? It might be deep down inside of them, this answer that they need answered. But I really feel like it's time for white people to
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, like I think that we need to just take this conversation and push it forward, and we ought to be having the conversation among ourselves. However, this is something I hear, I guess, a lot from my students, college-age students, from millennials who are in some ways much more sensitive to tone than people of my generation, and partly it is there's a lot more emphasis on the words that we use regarding gender and race, and I would say just about any kind of identity, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more sensitivity to that, and so these questions come up. For example, this is what one of my millennial friends asked me to ask you is, how do white people go from empowering the cause of racial justice to infringing on Black voices?
So I think that deep down inside, right, we have the concept of white guilt and this white saviors complex has always been a thing, right? What white people need to understand is that when they speak up, sometimes they stifle and they muffle voices that need to be heard, right? And so I think that as all of us are, we're lifelong learners. I'm not saying that anybody, any ethnicity of people are going to have all the answers. I just don't. But I really feel like if you try to educate yourself on terms to use and terms not to use, right, that these conversations begin to be a little bit more easier to have. Like, for instance, if a white person is to call me boy, I'm absolutely not in the conversation anymore. You know what I mean? There is a very derogatory epithet behind using that word, right? It is meant to belittle me as a man, as a person, right? And so I really feel like not only do we need to have those conversations, but white people need to essentially educate themselves on what to say and what not to say. And so the protests that are happening in La Crosse, Wisconsin, nonetheless, are organized by all white women, essentially. And I understand what they're trying to do, right? But it does get in the way of voices that need to be heard, right? And sometimes what they're projecting through these, ideological megaphones very loudly, it's wrong, right? It's wrong. And so, of course, we need to stand side by side and have these conversations. What does justice look like, to white people, to Black people rather, from a white person's standpoint? And I've had to answer this. Now, sadly, I've had to answer this way too late after protests and after things that I completely have disdain for. But what justice looked like, what it looks like, is actual reform, right? It is, am I for the protesting? I absolutely am for the protesting, right? But I really feel like if we're going to cause any kind of change, it needs to happen via, our statutes. It needs to happen via our laws and our policies. And so that is what real justice looks like. That's what real change looks like. So, I wish I had, a cut, blunt answer for, white people sometimes muffling voices that need to be heard because their voices are just a little more louder than ours. And sadly, they're a lot more listened to than ours are. But I feel as well that's another question that white people need to answer themselves. Because for far too long, what we don't want is for you to be speaking for us, right? And so that is what we've been seeing quite often.
One thing we talked about the other day was in your work on the school board, trying to advocate for a curriculum that is more respectful of minorities. And so one of the things that you had done is push to get To Kill a Mockingbird out of the curriculum. And
right.
And could you just talk about that? I know this has been talked about in the media and so forth, but I'd like to hear it from you. Like, what is the reason? Because this, and here's where I'm coming from. I mean, I believe I agree with you, but I'm concerned also that we are losing some of the literary works that are a common language for everybody. And are we replacing, when we lose something like To Kill a Mockingbird, are we replacing with something else that everybody is reading, so we've got some kind of common reference points as a culture?
Sure, absolutely. So the framework for pushing those type of books out of the classroom it's the same ideological mindset of white people not wanting to talk about race because it's uncomfortable. And so when you are uncomfortable in class, right, as we know our percent of Black kids opposed to their white, counterparts and classmates, what happens is it creates this very uncomfortable environment for Black kids, right? I actually went to an all-Black school when I was young, right? From 4th grade all the way until 9th grade. And to look at Roots in front of people that looked like me, watch the movie Roots in front of my classmates who had the same skin tone as I did, was indubitably uncomfortable, right? To see us on that screen, to see our ancestors on that screen being abused and mistreated by, you know, white people was very uncomfortable. So the concept is, if you are uncomfortable, then your mind is closed off, right? So we're really not learning. The concept of learning is to be free-flowing, right? To understand that your classmate is a place conducive to a safe environment. And I'm more able to learn, right? If that's the case. If it's not the case, I'm not. So it just doesn't, it doesn't draw parallel to one another, and it's super counterproductive. Now, I understand the concept about getting these, it's a piece of art, actually, a literary genius he is for writing this book, but I do feel like we do have to leave it up to households as well to educate their kids, right? Mm-hmm. And is it the responsibility of a school or a teacher to be teaching something that makes kids uncomfortable, especially kids that are not theirs? Am I able to sit down with my little brother and my little sister and read To Kill a Mockingbird to them? To Kill a Mockingbird? Absolutely, right? Like, that's easy for me. And I know how to calm them, right? I know how to talk to them. When we get to a very nasty part of the book, I know how to bring it to them. And I don't believe that white teachers are equipped with that same, sadly, I want to say, empathy, you know, and sympathy as well, to be able to.
Like even if I'm not even sure if I were trained in how to do that, I'm not sure I could. Right.
Well,
the fact of race becomes a barrier to do it.
Absolutely, yeah. And to go into a conversation I had with you, as a professor at higher education, you find it, you know, and I don't want to speak for you, but you find it very hard to have those conversations with kids in college, right? So I really feel like we need to pull back a little bit when it comes to making our kids extremely uncomfortable. There are literary works out there that are you know, are beautiful pieces of literary art. But I'd much rather let them discover that or have it introduced to them via someone who can soothe them, right? Like, and not in a classroom where all the white kids are staring at them and looking at them, and they're uncomfortable, and it's harder for them to learn. We send our kids to school to learn, right? Mm-hmm. And if they're not learning because they're uncomfortable, it's counterproductive, essentially.
Yeah, I actually found it both fairly easy and very rewarding to talk about race when I was teaching in Memphis and Baltimore, because we had very diverse classrooms, and then so you had multiple voices and you weren't singling anybody out to be a representative. But I find it very difficult when there's only 1 or 2 minority students in a classroom to do that. And so I just never have that kind of discussion unless I can speak to the students first and find out what their comfort level is.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I don't know if your listeners know, but I went to Viterbo, you know, where you teach. That's where we met each other. And I could probably count on, you know, one hand how many Black kids I know that went there when I went there, right? And so, yeah, those conversations are very, very hard to have, especially if you're in a city or on a university campus that is predominantly white.
This is just somebody brought this to my attention. This is a speech that Barack Obama gave in 2018. And he said, the more cynical people are about government, the angrier and more dispirited they are about the prospects for change, the more likely the powerful are able to maintain their power. And one of the things I've admired about you is your willingness to get involved in institutional reform. So, for example, you're running for school board and getting elected to school board, and your work to change the system from within. And I think that that seems to me to be what Obama was talking about there, like that we've got the society in which if we identify racial injustices, it's really important to have people working from within.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I've always had this sense of optimism, right? Like I just feel optimistic about things in a sense. And so it's really funny. I had this conversation with one of my friends just the other day. He said to me, we were talking about what justice looks like. And I told him that we have to get statutes and laws changed. We have to beat down the doors of our elected officials and let them hear our voices. And he said, well, Keonte, how long has that been going on? And to his credit, forever, right? And so, but I also had to drop a gem on him. And that gem was, there was a time actually where I had to sit, or our people had to sit in the back of the bus, right? Where we couldn't drink out the same water fountain or eat in the same restaurant. And these were federal laws, right? These were policies put in place. And so that changed. So I just always have a glimpse of optimism because I will not be defeated, right? Like I will never walk around with my head down, and I will not ever oblige to the idea that nothing is never going to change or happen. It's just, I'd much rather not think like that. I'm much of an opportunistic individual. I just feel like, if you put in the work, right? If you're running for offices in your city or your town, right, I really feel like you can make a change. And so that's exactly what Obama ran on. Sadly, I wish there was a little bit more change that came by way of our first Black president, but was it changed? It was changed nonetheless, right? And so we just have to continue and further that. It's about our community. It's about the people in it. And I feel like we need to create our own wave of change. And the only way you do that is by doing it. There's so many people, Rick, I'll tell you, I sit down in so many of these boardrooms, sadly, maybe one or two of the Black faces in it. And I lend my voice to people. And when I get up, it feels as if though this was just a good talk, right? Like I don't see anything coming from it. And I'll tell you, actually, I'm not going to put these people on the spot, but there was a situation where we held a meeting and we invited people to come. And these people were working on a museum exhibit, right? For a museum that could potentially come to La Crosse, right? And so we gave them all these really good ideas and we went into depth and we talked about absolutely everything, right? And so I actually brought up the concept of that I think that there should be a museum component for music, African-American music, even dating back to Africa as well. The origination of jazz and all that kind of stuff, right? And so before I went into detail, I asked him, I said, hey, so do you know what I mean when I say that we need to implement a component of music? And they said, it was a whole bunch of them, students from, UWL. They said, oh, no, we don't know what you mean. And I had to break it down to them. I said, well, this is what I mean. I mean, jazz, I mean this, I mean, early rock and roll, I mean. And so I really feel as if though, sometimes it can be very discerning, right? Getting up from these tables and feeling like as if though nothing is going to change. But like I say, my story is a very gut-wrenching one, and one that I should not have survived myself, and I did. And I did it because I was always optimistic about the future, right? So just a little tidbit there, but yeah, just a real interesting process, right, of gathering information. And then when you gather the information, you can't really comprehend it, correctly. And, they would have gotten up from that table if I didn't say, hey, do you really know what I mean when I say this? And nothing would have come about it. So just to get us back on schedule there, but yeah.
That's the nature of the work. When you're trying to do any kind of reform of long-standing institutions of any kind. It's a really slow process because there's an inertia that sets in, and so thank you for doing that kind of work, and also just thanks for just sitting down and talking with me about this.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
absolutely. Thanks for inviting me. I'd been seeing your tidbits on Facebook, and I said, well, I want to do that. So it was really cool that you actually called me and said, let's do something. And I was going crazy on Facebook. So yeah.
I've been reading some of your rants, and
Right.
it's good to read. And
It is.
but yeah, well, thank you for the work you're doing there, for the work you're doing in our community, and I appreciate our friendships. I know we'll be seeing each other again soon. So
I'm hoping on the basketball court sometime soon.
yeah, I hope that's not too far off.
Indeed. All right. Thank you very much for having me, Rick.
Okay. Yeah. Take care.
You too.